So usually when I start talks on this topic, I'll do a bit about how transformational and how great the promise of self-driving cars is. Every day that goes by, though, I feel this becomes less necessary because people tend to have a pretty good idea of the promise that these cars bring. So I'm just going to summarize this in one chart. These, I think, are the things that are pulling us away from what you could call the tedious and casual carnage that is driving ourselves on the roads towards autonomous driving. So the biggest thing that people talk about when they talk about the appeal of autonomous cars is the promise that eventually these cars will be much safer than we are. Last year, there were 40,200 traffic fatalities on our roads. That's a number that's been going up in recent years after falling for decades. A McKinsey analysis suggested that that number will be reduced by 90%. We'll go from 40,000 to 4,000. Convenience is another obvious factor. So Americans, on average, live for about 27,000 days. In that time, we will spend about 280 days reading for pleasure. We will spend about 180 days exercising. We'll spend about 117 days having sex. And we will spend 1,500 days in our car. So you can think of the 4 years that you may have spent at university, all the life-changing nights that you had, all the eye-opening classes that you had, all the mundane ones, and that entire 4 years that you spent at university is still less than the time you'll spend in your lifetime in your car. There's debate about the sustainability aspect. Is this going to actually make things more efficient? Is it going to make things less efficient? And there is the promise of just increased productivity. At the same time, though, there's a bunch of things which are in the way. There are a bunch of aspects which are pushing us away from this future. There are still technological challenges. Snow is a big one. There are vested interests. There's the perceived expense as insurance costs get transferred from where they are now to a package in the price of a car. But then there's some psychological factors, and those are the ones that I want to talk about today. And in particular, I want to talk about the fear. So there was a recent AAA poll that showed that 78% of people who are polled fear a self-driving car. And that number was unchanged from the year before. And even among millennials, who you'd think would be the early adopters, comfortable with technology, that number was at 73%. So my colleagues and I, Iyad Rahwan, who's a computer scientist at MIT, and Jean-François Bonnefond, who's a social psychologist at the University of Toulouse, we recently published this paper looking at the psychological roadblocks, which is a pun, to self-driving cars. And we laid out 3 categories as we saw them. So the first is the one that I'm going to primarily talk about today, which is about ethical dilemmas. The second, which I won't talk about, but I can talk about it Q&A or individually later on, is about psychological heuristics that we have that are going to make us overstate the danger of these cars when they get in the inevitable accidents that they do. And then third is the issue of trying to get us to wrap our minds around an entirely new type of driver. We can intuit how humans act because we can literally simulate their minds on our minds because we share common types of minds. But once you have the machine mind, that requires us to think about other drivers in an entirely different way. But like I said, I want to focus on the ethical and social dilemmas. So let's start with an ethical dilemma. So last year, we published this paper where we gave people a simplified and stylized dilemma that will be faced by autonomous cars. So imagine that that's an autonomous car. It has one passenger. And then all of a sudden, 2 pedestrians appear in front of you. And for some reason, the reason actually doesn't matter, which I'll talk about in a second, the car can't stop. Either the brakes fail, it's going too fast, whatever. In this situation, it has 2 options. The car can do one of 2 things. It can either swerve into the side of the road, killing the passenger, or it can continue ahead and kill the 2 pedestrians. Now, the question that animated this paper, and a lot of our work since, is what kind of car do people want? On the one hand, there is the utilitarian option that the car should weigh all lives equally, and 2 is greater than 1. Therefore, if it has the option to save 2 lives, sacrifice just 1, well, it should take that option. It should not differentially weigh the fact that some are pedestrians and some are passengers. On the other hand, there's another perspective, the deontological perspective, often associated with Immanuel Kant, which says that there are inviolable rules that we shouldn't get in the way of, even if the consequences would be a utilitarian benefit. So one of these rules could be that a car should not purposefully harm its owner. And the question is, well, what kind of car do people want? And it turns out that's actually a more complicated question than it seems at first, because you could be asking what kind of car is more ethical. You could be asking what kind of car do people want to have on the roads? And if you ask the question in this way, you find that the answer was clear. Jeremy Bentham wins. Utilitarianism wins. People say, well, we should have the car that saves the greatest number. But we ask the question a third way, which is, what kind of car would you buy? And there, we saw a totally different response. So there, people were willing to sacrifice 10 pedestrians to have a car that was self-protective. And this is actually quite a remarkable thing from the perspective of a psychologist. So usually what you see is that people really strive to do things which they perceive to be ethical, or if they're going to do something unethical, they will somehow find some sort of mental gymnastics to say that it wasn't unethical at all. But in this case, they were actively telling us, that's the ethical car, this is the one I want to buy. I want to buy the one I recognize to be unethical. And in a way, you can't really blame people, because I think this is a new type of consumer product, one that hasn't existed before. I can't think of another product that could be designed to, in some circumstances, potentially, deliberately harm its owner. I was trying to rack my brain about this. The only other example I could think of is S&M gear, which people might buy to harm their owner, but the desire is to be harmed. Here, this is a desire which isn't. Somebody else gave me another example, which are cyanide capsules. That might be the only other option. But I think when we yield our autonomy to artificially intelligent agents, we're introducing this new idea on the road. Now, you might be jumping at the conclusion that, well, this is a really ridiculous scenario, and it kind of is a ridiculous scenario, and some people have taken issue with it. So this is Rodney Brooks, who was the founder of iRobot, which makes the Roombas, which track your house. And he said, caustically, this is a made-up question that will have no practical impact on any automobile or person for the foreseeable future. Just as these questions never come up for human drivers, they won't come up for self-driving cars. It is pure mental masturbation dressed up as moral philosophy. You can set up websites and argue about it all you want. The problem is both non-existent and irrelevant. So he's right about one thing and then wrong about the rest here. The one thing he's right about is the scenarios that we presented are cartoonish. It's unlikely that that particular scenario will ever come up. However, that's not why we present scenarios like that. The reason you present these simplified black and white scenarios is that they make stark the ethical trade-offs that are inherent in those decisions, and those ethical trade-offs are things that we actually employ in our driving all the time. So whereas those types of accidents are rare, small maneuvers that we always make, in which risk is differentially apportioned between people on the road, are made all the time. So I'll give you an example. We make these ethical decisions frequently when we're driving. So imagine you are here somewhere in the center of the road, you're the car in the middle, and you have on the one side you have a cyclist, and you have on the other side you have a big semi-truck. Where you move laterally in the lane is differentially apportioning risk to people who are either more vulnerable than you or less vulnerable than you. You could not want to drive close to the semi-truck because you're scared of what might happen to you in the potentiality that you guys collide. And as a result, you might hew a little closer to the cyclist. That puts the cyclist at more risk. Or you could hew closer to the semi-truck. That's an ethical decision. It's an implicit ethical decision we don't even realize we're making. Similarly, when you decide how much room you're going to leave between the car in front of you and the car behind you. Similarly, when you decide how fast you're going to drive. Similarly, in those more rare and extreme cases, if you're about to hit a tree and you decide whether you're going to swerve to the right and to take the brunt of the impact yourself, or swerve to the left to let the impact be taken by your passenger, those are ethical decisions that we make all the time. When humans make them, we recognize that they're making them on the basis of instinct, in the heat of the moment. We don't really hold each other that morally accountable for them. But once these implicit ethical decisions are programmed into autonomous cars, they have to now be made explicitly. They have to be made now with the luxury of deliberation, and with the luxury of deliberation comes the responsibility of deliberation, which means these are questions that the autonomous car industry has to take seriously when they're programming these cars. So this is a patent from a few years ago that I think illustrates this very nicely. So this is Google talking about their self-driving car, and they paint this scenario in which the self-driving car is behind a truck, and the truck is occluding the vision of any of the cars that are ahead of it, and the traffic light itself. And the truck for some reason is not moving, and so the self-driving car has to make a decision of whether it's going to go around the truck or not. And it's very telling at how they revealed what the decision-making process that the car would go through would be. So what they did is they presented this table, and they say the decision is going to be made on this column, the risk penalty. So whatever is the lowest risk penalty, that gets factored into the benefit of being able to go around the car, and you determine whether it's an action that you want to take or not. But to determine the risk penalty, what you have to do is you have to consider all these possibilities. You might have a 0.01% chance of getting hit by a large truck or an oncoming vehicle. There might be a 0.001% chance of hitting a pedestrian that runs into the road. But notably is this other column where they calculate the risk magnitude. How bad would it be if that happened? And to arrive at the risk penalty, you just have to multiply the first column by the second column. But to derive the point values that are in the first column, that's a subjective assessment. There you're determining how bad, how unethical any of these situations would be. So you see that, well, getting hit by a truck, there's 5,000 points of badness that are associated with that. But hitting a pedestrian, that's 100,000 points. Those numbers could be based on actuarial tables. They could be based on insurance claims. But there is a subjective element in them. All right. So what that means is that we have a finding where people want, from an ethical perspective, they want self-driving cars in general to treat everybody equally. But they want their self-driving cars to treat them better. And in that, the ethical dilemma that we're talking about reveals another dilemma. It reveals a social dilemma. So a social dilemma is a concept that's talked about by economists and psychologists and evolutionary biologists, in which when you have a group of people, individuals have the option to free ride on the group. And in any case when the individual can free ride on the group, they're better off doing so. However, if everybody free rides on the group, then everybody ends up worse off. So I'll give you an example to make this more concrete. Actually, you guys probably know about this stuff very well, but I'll give you the example. The classic example is Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. He gave the example of sheep that are grazing on land, and so long as you stay at a sustainable level of sheep, everybody's fine, and the land can sustain that much grazing. But if some entrepreneurial spirit decides, well, I should put 2 sheep, whereas everybody else is just putting 1 sheep, that will double my profits, and the cost of that will be distributed among all the other herders. And so it's only going to negatively affect everybody else a little bit, whereas it'll be a big benefit to me, so I'm very tempted to do that. But if everybody does that, well, now you overgraze the land, and as a result, everybody ends up worse off. Another example of a social dilemma is the public goods dilemma. Here, instead of everybody being tempted to take a little too much, people become tempted to contribute too little. So if you decide that your village needs a road, everybody will benefit from having that road, and so it's worth pooling your resources together. Everybody would be better off if we pool our resources together and build a road. But you would, as an individual, be best off if everybody else contributed to the road and you kept your money but then used the road anyways. And everybody else is facing that same temptation. As a result, the road might not ever be developed. Now, When we're talking about the cars, it seems that people agree on what the ideal future is. The ideal ethical future is that we have utilitarian cars that treat everybody equally. However, people don't seem to be willing to pay the small sacrifice in terms of their own safety in these small risk allocation maneuvers in order to get us to that future. And as a result, we might be left with a generally less safe future. That's a social dilemma. Now, the dilemma is evident to the car companies as well. So the challenge is that as a private industry, as a private company, you need people to buy your cars. And if people are telling you that they want to buy the cars that are self-protective, well, you build cars that are self-protective. On the other hand, you could build cars that are utilitarian. If you build cars that are utilitarian, people aren't going to buy them. And so that's the danger. So why would you not just build all the self-protective cars? The danger there is instead of offending your consumers so that they don't buy your cars, you offend the public in general. You risk public outrage. This was evident last year when a number of car companies were asked about this particular scenario. And most of them wisely just avoided the question. They avoided answering. So Volvo, for instance, said, oh, well, our cars will never crash, so we don't have to deal with that scenario. However, there was one car company that hazarded an answer, and that was Mercedes at a car show. One of their executives who was in charge of safety for their self-driving car division said in an interview, when asked this question, well, what would we do? And he sort of suggested, somewhat obliquely, that in this situation, we build our cars for our consumers. As a result, we would design our car to be self-protective. But then this happened. Somehow, the Daily Mail, from what he said here, got this. Mercedes-Benz admits automated driverless cars would run over a child rather than swerve and risk injuring the passengers inside. This was just one example of the mass amount of internet outrage that was developed that emerged when Christopher von Hugo made this initial somewhat cautious statement. As a result, now Mercedes says its driverless cars won't run over pedestrians. That would be illegal. So they did a 180-degree on this, even though it's in their business interests, seemingly, to appeal entirely to the consumers. They realize the public outrage is a very real concern. Now, that raises this third dilemma, which is what we call the meta-ethical dilemma. Because the way that people tend to solve a social dilemma, one way is through government regulation. So you can regulate the amount of grazing on a piece of land. You can charge taxes for a public good so people are forced to pay. In the case of autonomous cars, though, were the government to say regulate that all the cars be utilitarian, people are not forced to buy the cars now, not like you're forced to pay taxes. In this case, you have this other option. You can just not buy the cars and keep the human-driven cars that we have now. The consequence of that, however, is that we don't reach this safer, more convenient future that the self-driving cars promise. Instead, we're left with the tedious and casual carnage that we have today. So our attempts to maximize safety might ultimately undermine this future entirely. Amy, how much time do I have left? Amy?
Oh, keep going.
Keep going? Okay. So with this last bit of the talk, I want to draw your attention to a website that my colleagues and I developed after our first paper on this topic came out. It's called The Moral Machine. And what it allows us to do is it sort of gamifies these ethical scenarios. And in a way, there's a bunch of frivolous things that we put in here just to capture people's attention. But one of the things it does is it allows you to make very clear to yourself where your own ethical commitments lie and where your ethical trade-offs are. So I want to actually have a bit of audience participation here. I'm going to go through 4 scenarios where there's either-or ethical decisions that you guys have to make. And I want to just, through show of hands, get an idea of what you guys think are the most ethical things in these particular scenarios. So if you look up here, I'll just describe what you're looking at. People who go on the website, they'll get 13 of these scenarios and just have to click on whichever one they think is the more ethical. So here you have a self-driving car on your left, which is going to go directly into a barrier, in which case the 2 passengers are killed, or it can swerve and it can kill the 2 pedestrians. Those are its only options. The brakes fail. Remember, cartoonish scenario, simplified, stylized scenario. So these are your only 2 options. So who thinks that the car, by show of hands, should just plow through into the barrier and kill the existing passengers? Hands up. Okay. And who thinks it should swerve to kill the pedestrians? All right. Okay. So about 2/3 are saying that it should kill the passengers. The other third says that it should go through an active commission and swerve deliberately to kill the pedestrians. In our moral machine, when we aggregate the results of millions of people who've done this game, we've had about 4 million people and 30 million individual ethical decisions. We get pretty much the same results as we saw here. So people seem to agree with you that there's a slight preference to kill the passengers in this situation. Let's try another one. So here you have now a little boy. And there's nobody in the car. So the car, if it continues, if it makes no correction to its trajectory, it'll run over a little boy. If it swerves, it will run over the full-grown man. So who says that it should continue straight and run over the little boy? Hands up. Okay, so maybe 10. And who says that it should turn and hit the full-grown man? Okay, a lot more. So it's pretty clear here that the act of omission versus commission seems to be subsumed with the preference for a certain age group in this situation. Nobody wants to be the one to kill the little boy. Nobody wants to be the one who's seen putting their hand up to kill the little boy. This is what we got on the moral machine, which is actually not nearly as stark as what you guys did, but these are people who are sitting at home in their basements making these decisions, and they don't have their decisions visible to everybody else. We'll do 2 more here. So here what we're doing is we're introducing joggers, and we're also introducing the act of breaking the law in terms of jaywalking or jay-jogging. So if the car was to go straight, it would run over a guy who's crossing the light at the green. He's abiding by the law, but it could swerve to hit the jogger who's crossing the light at the red. So who says it should stay on its current trajectory, not turn and kill the guy who's abiding by the law? Hands up. Okay, 3. I guess the rest of you guys want to kill the jogger, which seems fine. But here's where it gets a little more complicated. So this last one is where you pit 2 compelling ethical commitments against each other. Now you have 2 people who are crossing at the red. So it can either go straight and run over one person who is abiding by the law, or it can deliberately swerve and kill 2 people who are breaking the law. So who says it has to go straight? Run over the one person who's abiding by the law? Hands up. All right. And who says that it should turn and kill the 2 people? Oh, wow. Oh, okay. Okay. You guys were a lot more decisive about that than our moral machine group. Moral machine group was actually quite split on that particular issue. And so once we crunch these millions of data points that we have, we can get an idea of what people see as the primary ethical trade-offs and what values people seem to prioritize. So when it's not you in the car, people don't seem to show a preference for passengers versus pedestrians. It's only when you ask them if they would buy the car that you see that emerge. Utilitarianism seems to matter a lot to people, and upholding the law seems to matter a lot. However, these things are not consistent across countries. Because we've had so many people, we've had people from about 204 countries, and we've had sufficient numbers to compare people across countries, and we find that there are systematic differences between how people prioritize these particular values. So this is going to be pretty hard for you guys to see from back there, but we have on the x-axis here the priority that people give to saving the lawful. So you guys who decided that you should sacrifice a greater number because they're breaking the law would score very high on the x-axis here. And what you tend to find is that people in richer countries agree with your position. People in poorer countries, however, have less of a priority for punishing, I guess, or sacrificing people who are jaywalking. And you can think about that in a way that sort of makes sense. If you think about a place like Japan or Germany, where people are very reticent to jaywalk ever, compared to a place which is a little more chaotic, places I've been like Nigeria or India, people are jaywalking all the time. And it seems like a more extreme thing to punish them for doing that. Social value priority, this is where we have different characters. So in places where there's a high level of human development, people tend to treat all lives equally. If it's a criminal, if it's a doctor, if it's a young person or an old person, they'll treat them equally. But as you go to places which have a lower HDI, people then tend to make more distinctions. They'll have a greater preference to save executives and doctors over criminals and homeless people. And then finally, if you look here at utilitarianism, you find that the best predictor of that is the faith in the institutions of the rule of law. In places where people trust the secular institutions of rule of law, people tend to be driven by utilitarianism above all. They say that all lives should be treated equally. You can only do that, I think, if you trust the system. Okay, I'm going to cut it out there. Thank you guys very much.